and start at the very beginning of chapter 17. The first few things I'm going to kind of go sort of quickly since we got into them. The spotlight in this particular chapter is examples of Christian proof. The sidelights include Timothy, the review of the first journey, sights of the second trip, and talking about Roman citizenship and how that is a very important thing. Paul was a very unusual individual in the fact that not only was he a Roman citizen, but he was also evidently a very influential Jew. And this dual citizenship in the realm of Judaism and the realm of Roman citizenship comes several times to be his out of getting out of difficulties and so forth. Here's a map that depicts the second missionary journey, which really started out in Jerusalem after the conference in chapter 15. They go back to Antioch and deliver the letter that the elders and the congregation and the apostles put together. And the people in Antioch rejoice because they're not going to have to go through circumcision. They're not going to have to go through Judaism in order to be good children of God. From there, he goes to Derbe. He goes back to Iconium, to Lystra, where he picks up Timothy. And Timothy joins the entourage, goes to Iconium and is denied going into Bithynia and Pontus, into the other northern part of Mysia, and ends up at Troas, where he has a vision of the Macedonian man saying, "Come over here and help us." About that same time, Luke joins the entourage. And the technology of the sentences changes from they to us or to we. He goes across to Neapolis, which is on the seacoast. He goes inland to Philippi. And there, of course, he meets Lydia and the Philippian jailer. And then moves on through Amphipolis to Apollonia to Thessalonica. Thessalonica runs into some problems. Because some of the unbelieving Jews follow him there and cause difficulties. Basically chase him out of Thessalonica. He goes to Berea. And those people are considered more noble than those in Thessalonica because they search the scriptures daily. Find out if what Paul and Silas are saying is really true. And then because of difficulties from the people in Thessalonica coming down to Berea, he flees like he's going to the seacoast, but ends up in Athens. And that's where basically chapter 17 ends when we get to that. And even though this shows like a second journey, going to Corinth, Berea, to Ephesus, and then back to Caesarea and Jerusalem. We pick that up in chapter 18, which is the finish of this second journey. Okay. The highlights Thessalonian problems, his message about the Messiah, the reaction accepted it, some violently reject the message, the Bereans Bible study, ready-minded searching the scriptures, Jewish intervention from Thessalonica, and the Athenian opportunity, and I think I'll enjoy some pictures that I have for that. The problem with widespread idolatry in Athens, and the message for the synagogue and the marketplace on Mars Hill, the sermon that was there, and I have a picture of Mars Hill. Stood there, and in 1984, and it was just an emotional experience for me to be where the Apostle Paul had been at one time. There was a preacher from another religious group that was with us, and he was standing there, and he said, "Well, what's the significance of this place?" And it was kind of interesting because, and I'll point this out a little bit later on, the plaque that was on the steps going up to the Mars Hill was wrong. He said this is the place where Peter had preached. And I hope by now that they've changed that great bronze plaque so that it was Paul and not Peter that was there. After Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. We covered this, and what do we know about Thessalonica? It was about 100 miles southwest of Philippi, was the capital of the 2nd Division of Macedonia, and was well suited as a town for commerce and trade. The map shows it just slightly inland, which would probably indicate that there was a river. And you have to remember that most major towns were very like our major towns in this country. They were built on a river for commerce, to going north, to going further downstream, or having goods brought upstream to where they were. I'll use this map several times to point out these different places. Paul went in as his custom was, and on 3 Sabbath days, argued with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, "This is the Messiah, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you." It's very difficult sometimes to talk to people about Jesus who do not know the Bible and they do not know God. It's sort of like trying to answer the old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, my wife's, one of her doctors one time was talking about the recovery process that she was going to go through. And he said, it was sort of like the old adage, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And I said, well, it's obvious the chicken came first. He said, well, I never heard anybody say that. And I said, well, how do you get an egg? I said, you get it from a chicken. If you don't have a chicken, you can't have an egg. So the chicken came first. He laughed. And every time I saw him in the halls of the hospital from then on, or at the office over there, he always remembered of what I had said about what came first, the chicken or the egg. You have to remember, in the creation, God created everything in a mature sense so that it could reproduce after itself. And after all, if he had created the egg first, how would it have hatched without a mama hen to sit on it? Duh. You know, some people just come up with some very foolish things. What was the manner or custom of Paul? It was going to the synagogue for worship on the Sabbath day. And every place where there were Jews, Paul went to them first to deliver the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, what is meant by the opening and the alleging, or the explaining and the proving of the Scriptures? This refers to Paul using the Old Testament Scriptures to prove that this Jesus he is preaching about is the Christ, the Messiah that is promised by God. There are many things about the New Testament that we won't understand unless we understand what is written in the Old Testament. It is a process of bringing God's people to a certain point so that the Christ would be born, and then to move them past that point into what today we know as Christianity. This simply refers to Paul using the Old Testament Scriptures. Verse 4, some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. Now, these devout Greeks could have been one of two categories. One, they were proselytes into Judaism, or they were very similar to Cornelius, being people who had heard about. We do not see anywhere that Cornelius was a proselyte, but he was one who believed in God and worshiped God, and gave a lot of money, evidently, to the poor people. The Jews became jealous And with the help of some ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and they set the city in an uproar. And while they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. Interesting picture. There's the mob outside. There's Jason meeting them at the door. There's Paul and Silas. They're trying to get them out the back way. Now, why would these people follow Paul and Silas around? Well, it's kind of obvious, because they wanted to learn more and they wanted to be in the presence of their newfound friends and the teachers of the good news. After all, what would they have known about the church? What would they have known about worship to God if these were heathen individuals, and these were Greeks, and some of them were Jews, and some of them needed to know how the Old Testament connected to Jesus and what was being done at that particular time. Who were these devout Greeks? Probably Gentiles who, like Cornelius, were worshipers of the true God, maybe converts to Judaism, maybe proselytes. We do not know, because the scriptures just simply do not give us that specific information. So when the mob could not find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some of the believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests, and they are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying there is another king named Jesus." They are upset, and they want to cause difficulties and problems. Who are the principal people in the riot? The unbelieving Jews. Now, let me paint the scenario for you. Paul comes into town and he goes to synagogue to worship. And as usually the custom from somebody that is from afar off or specifically out of town, it was the custom in those days and times to ask them for what's going on. After all, they didn't have Wikipedia, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have radios, they didn't have television, they didn't have newspapers, and so the information that oftentimes they got sometimes was months behind what had really happened. But it was news to them. And so they would invite visitors to say, you got anything to say? Now's the time to say it. And of course, Paul wouldn't talk about the mundane things of what's going on and whether or not the chariot fell off the side of the road and the donkey died or that kind of thing. But he talked to them about the scriptures. He talked to them about how that this Jesus of Nazareth that was crucified was this Messiah that they had been looking for. And yet there are some that just absolutely refuse to believe that. We have people that hard-headed still today. When you talk to them about being baptized, they say, no, I'm not going to get in that water. If God had asked us as a sign of our commitment to Him to cut off the little finger of our left hand, how many of us would have only 9 fingers? Everyone in here would only have 9 fingers. But all that He asked of us was something that was very simple and something that was not very dangerous. I don't know. I have to back up on that statement. I've seen some preachers that I thought were going to drown some folks. It was not a pretty scene whatsoever. One that comes to my mind was an elderly man that I baptized in Somerset. And when he came forward and we got in the baptistry, and one of the elders was there, and I baptized the fellow, and evidently his foot came up out of the water. And this elder said, "You didn't get him all the way under. His foot came up." Well, his foot had been under. And he said, "Push him under again." And I told the man, I said, "Hang on, here we go." And I pushed him under again. And so I guess he thought I was trying to drown him. I wasn't. But he remained faithful till he died. He was a good man. Through whom did these unbelieving Jews operate? Well, most of the time they never do it themselves, but they kind of, in subterfuge, get somebody else to do this. Through these market loungers, the idlers about in the public places, these are the old guys that sat at the around the courthouse, whittling on their cedar sticks and spitting tobacco on the floor. These are the guys that always have the answer. Tom's laughing because I preached up where he was from one time, and I talked about the courthouse that was there, and I said, I could see all the way through the courthouse. The courthouse was, what, 2 stories? There's 2 stories, but only about this wide. And you could see all the way through on the thing. And here out there every day, there was these guys sitting out there on the benches, chawing and making shavings off of their sticks. Well, they know how to solve every problem in the nation, but they never get to it. And so that's why they need one of those round to-its, so they can get around to doing what they think. Why would they encourage these men? Because they had little else to do, and to raise a ruckus was a fun thing to do. Besides, these were strangers that were brought in with strange doctrines, and it's not hard to throw a rock at a strange dog, is it? Yeah, if the dog comes across the yard and you know it's your neighbor's dog, you probably won't throw a rock at it. You might. I had one of my neighbor's dogs I had to throw rocks at because he liked to come over and mess on my bushes. Why was Jason the one picked upon on this right? Evidently, Paul and Silas had been seen with Jason. They may have even been staying at his house. The previous verse says that he had entertained them or offered them hospitality, but they weren't at home at the time the mob arrived. What was the charge that was leveled against Paul and Silas? They were changing things. Boy, we still hear that in our day and time, don't we, Johnny? They've caused turmoil with their doctrine in other places and now have come here to do the same. I spent some time last night looking at, you remember some time ago we had an opportunity for everybody to write down some things that you think would help our congregation or things that might need to be changed. We had them on boards up here. I had Mark send that to me in an email, and I was looking through those things. There's some suggestions in there very good. There's some in there that are impossible. And there are some that there's no way that could ever be financed. It was just way too expensive to think about that. One of those things that was suggested was take out all these pews and put in chairs. How many of you got something in the mail today wanting you to make a donation to the new senior citizens thing? Did you see the price of that chair? $80 for the cheapest one. And it wasn't even padded. No. Can you imagine how many chairs that it would take to put in this auditorium and the amount of cost that would be involved? If it only took 100 chairs, how much money are you talking about?
It costs $80 a chair. It's a lot of money.
That's $80,000, isn't it? Close to it? Well, 100, but $8,300. Put 200 in here, that's 16,600, and that still wouldn't be enough chairs for when we have a big thing going on. Oh well. One of the suggestions was cut off the bolts that hold the pews down. Well, you know what would happen then? Some of us hefty guys that would lean back in this thing would tip over in the back one, and that would knock the next one over, and that would knock the next one over. And it would be hilarious, but it would be a mess to have to clean it back up and straighten it back and get them all lined back up just like they are. Well, these people don't like change. Why was this a problem with the Roman government? All Roman citizens were required to worship Caesar and to give homage only to him. They could have no other king. And so when you say Jesus is the king, God is the king, they become very upset. And so this is probably one of the reasons why these unbelieving Jews would use somebody else to do their dirty work. Okay. So the people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this. And after they had taken security from Jason and the others, they let them go. And that very night, the believers sent Paul and Silas off to Berea. And when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue, which was their thing to do. Now, what does it mean to take security? That doesn't mean to go hide in your house. It's very much like today when we allow a person to make bond, when they've been arrested for some reasonably minor type crime. This is to keep our jails from filling up. And evidently there's a lot of people can't post bond because the jail's full of people with very minor infractions of the law. It is a security that the person is going to appear in court. And if he does not, the bond is revoked. He loses at least his security deposit that he makes, which is usually in the vicinity of what, 10%? So if he's got a $1,000 bond, he has to put up $100. And if he has a $500,000 bond, he has to put up, $500,000, they have to put up $50,000, which usually means you put up your property, if you've got any. And he loses that, and then he's in more trouble with the court for failing to show up at the appointed time. See, the law hasn't changed an awful lot, and the system hasn't changed an awful lot in 2,000 years. Here are some of the remains of the ancient Thessalonica, so that you can see that this was a real place, and it's just not a name that was in the book somewhere. But this place actually existed. There's a lot of visitors there and a lot of tourists, and a lot of things evidently to see. That very night, the believers sent Paul and Silas off to Berea, and when they arrived, they went to the Jewish synagogue. And these Jews were more receptive than those in Thessalonica because they welcomed the message very eagerly and examined the scriptures every day to see whether these things were so. This is a little different rendition than what you're used to in the King James Version, but it still says the same thing and means the same thing. Now, where was Berea? Berea was about 45 miles southwest of Thessalonica. Now, we have to remember that most of the time their journey is by foot, their own foot. And the scripture says that when they left, they went to the synagogue. Well, they met on what you and I would call Friday night through Saturday night to Saturday evening, late. And so this meant that there was some time that was involved in them leaving Thessalonica and getting to Berea. When we find out there's 45 miles difference between the two, there's Thessalonica and there's Berea, then we can understand why he probably ended up getting there 4 or 5 days later than what the time element is. And another thing we have to remember too about the book of Acts, there's no real time element sometimes in what took place, unless it says "and the next day," or later that day, or some such expression. Why was this such a noble attitude for them to look into the Scriptures every single day? Here are folks that are honest in their attitude toward this new doctrine, and they want to see for themselves if what is being said is true to the Old Testament Scriptures. They checked out what Paul said. When I preached at Sevierville, I had a lady in the congregation that took notes of every sermon that I preached. Now, sometimes if she'd forget to take a piece of paper with her, she'd write it in the back of her checkbook, on the back of a deposit slip. And she would write down the major points and the Scriptures. And then she'd go home and she'd look them up. And she asked me one time, she says, "Does that bother you?" And I said, "No. Doesn't bother me at all." I said, "I enjoy knowing that I have caused people to study their Bible, to look into the Scriptures, to see if what I'm saying is true." It's just like what we're talking about here in the book of Acts. You need to go and read the book of Acts again to find out if what we're talking about here is correct. Why did so many of them believe? Because they checked out the message according to what the Scriptures taught, and when it was proved to be correct or true, they obeyed the gospel. They did what Paul suggested to them that they needed to do. But when the Jews of Thessalonica learned that the Word of God was being proclaimed by Paul in Berea as well, they came there too to stir up and incite the crowds. These guys are not real happy, and they want to cause difficulty and problems, and their descendants are alive and well today. Then the believers immediately sent Paul away to the coast, but Silas and Timothy remained behind, and those who conducted Paul, who brought him down there, basically, took him as far as Athens. And after receiving instructions to have Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible, they left him. Now, why Paul would be carrying a sword, I have not figured out yet. I just like this picture, and it just kind of suggested to me what I think Paul might have looked like. It doesn't depict whatever his problem was that he had, that he prayed to God 3 times to remove it. Some say they think it was eye problems. I don't know what it was. But why he's carrying a sword, I don't know. I guess that represents the sword of God. Why did they take him to go, as it were, to the sea? Well, it may not have been determined of where Paul was actually going to escape to during all of this ruckus, or it may have been only a ploy to make the Jews from Thessalonica believe he was actually going to sail away from their country. We don't know. I guess if you're getting away from a riot mob, that you probably want to use kind of a decoy so that they don't keep following you around. And why were Silas and Timothy left behind? Why weren't they persecuted like Paul was? Simply because Paul was the major spokesman. And as a result, they'd go after him first. Paul and Silas and Timothy probably were left to continue to teach the new Christians more about the church and what Christian duties were and what worship was all about in this new faith that they had found. Here are some of the remains of Berea. As you can see, the destruction here is a little more complete. These are not the only ruins that are found in Berea, but it just gives you a point to understand not only Thessalonica, but Berea were real places. They are real places. Now, where was Athens? Athens was about 120 miles southeast of Berea. Now, Thessalonica and Berea are only 45 miles apart. And this is almost 3 times the distance. And the good brothers that are with Paul take him to Athens before they turn around and go back home. Here's the map again, and here's where Athens is, quite a bit south to Berea. A little more than, about from here to Dalton, Georgia. That's about right. Tunnel Hill, Georgia. It's about 100 miles to Chattanooga, and then about 20 miles past that. Put you in the state of Georgia. While Paul was waiting for them, Silas and Timothy, in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. He argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. This is a beautiful shot that is made of the Acropolis. You have heard this oftentimes. The Acropolis simply means the rock. And in the middle of Athens is this huge rock that stands about 30 or 40 feet above everything else, about as tall as the roof here that we have. And this is where they built all of their temples, because they could be seen from anywhere in the city of Athens. When we first arrived there, it looked like, have you ever been to Mexico City? Any of you? That is one of the most amazing places that I've ever been. Athens is also like this. The houses are all about this far apart. And one morning we got up early and decided we'd walk out in where our hotel was just a block off of one of the residential areas. And we decided we'd walk down through this residential area to see how people lived in this day and time. And we came across, and every house had a little garden in the back of it. And next to the fence was this beautiful lilac rose. I'd never seen one like it. And it was about this big around. Just gorgeous. It looked like a peony. And we were sitting there admiring this, and the woman comes out. Of course, she couldn't speak English. We couldn't speak Greek. And she pointed to the rose, and I was trying to indicate to her how beautiful we thought it was. She picked it and handed it to Judy. And that was the kind of graciousness that was there. We went on down to the corner, and there on the corner was the fishmonger. The ladies would come out of their house every morning, and they would go down to the corner, and here was a guy with these wooden baskets that were out there, crates, and he had all these different kinds of fish in there, and they would go pick out the fish, and that was their meal for the day. Still doing things the old way. Beautiful, beautiful city. Why was Paul so greatly disturbed at what he found? He was disturbed that such a great city could be so taken by the consecration to false gods. What does history say about the city of Athens? Xenophon poetically describes the city as one great altar. This was a very religious city. Petronius, a Roman satirist, says it is easier to find a god than a man in Athens. Well, these were people that were talking about their own people. And they knew that this was a town that was just flooded. And not only were all these temples up on the Acropolis, but they were all over town. Here's a picture that was taken in 1984 of some of the ruins that are on the Acropolis. Some of them are more than 2,500, 3,000 years old. Here's a picture from the street where we were staying at the hotel. This is one that I took that shows the Acropolis, and see how it stands up there in the middle of everything. And this was a picture of the original Parthenon in Athens, Greece. And the lady in the green skirt is my wife, Judy. I waited about 5 minutes for this beautiful picture. It's not good and clear because this is taken with a small camera, and then it's digitized and then it's blown up, so it's not good and sharp. But the picture that I made from this is really good and sharp. How often do you get beautiful sunlight on the object that you're trying to take with a dark cloud in the background to set it off? That's one of the best photographs I've ever taken. Also, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. And they said, what does this babbler want to say? Others says, well, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities. This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus, and they asked him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? Now, who were the Epicureans? Well, they were the followers of Epicurus. They denied the creation and that the government of the world by God, and they taught that all things were the result of chance, and so pleasure was man's chief god. And their philosophy was eat, drink, and be merry. And we still have people today that subscribe to this same philosophy. Now, who were the Stoics? They were the followers of Zeno. They were sort of pantheists, and that means they were believers of gods of many things. This simply meant that they believed in a god of wine who was Dionysius. They believed in Athena. They believed in Zeus and Mars. And they had all of these different kinds, and a lot of minor deities also. They believed that God is the mere soul of the world, not a real God, but that the soul of the earth is what we should worship. They also believed that all things are the result of fate, that you can't change things, and that things couldn't be different than the current status quo. You take things as they are, that's it. No matter what you do, you can't change things. They were just individuals that were not really happy, to be quite frank. What was the Areopagus? It was the same as Mars Hill in verse 22. It was the place of the Supreme Court of Athens. It was a huge rock that overlooked the two main streets of the marketplace. It's interesting. I couldn't find the picture that I took from Mars Hill, but the two main streets of the store or the marketplace, one goes this way, one goes this way, and they meet in a V right at the foot of Mars Hill. It was here that Socrates had been tried and condemned for setting forth strange gods. Interesting. Here is the steps that lead up, and you can see the distance to the top of Mars Hill. The plaque that you see over on the right-hand side is the one, when we were there, was incorrect. It says that this was the place where Peter preached the Word of God first in Athens. So I hope that they have read their Bible and changed it by now. Here's what the rock looks like. This is Mars Hill. This is the Areopagus. Most of the time, and for many, many years, in my mind, when they said Areopagus, I thought of this as being a very formal place, and that this was probably a great amphitheater that they brought everybody in, and they set people down in the front, and everybody listened to what they had to say. Well, this is a pretty crude place. And they have guards on top of this rock all the time to keep the tourist from taking a souvenir. I got one. When he was fussing at somebody else and picking one up, I got it. I got me a rock that came from Mars Hill. I suppose it came from Mars Hill. It may have been from somewhere else. They may actually put them down for tourists to pick up, and then they charge them $5 for picking up something they're not supposed to pick up. But you can see how this sticks up. The marketplace, if I remember correctly, is back off this way. But it has been since 1984, so my memory has gone like my hair. It sounds strange to us, they say, so we'd like to know more what it means. And all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling and hearing something new. Why was the message of Christ so strange to them? The strangeness of this was the resurrection of the dead. No other religion preached this. Others taught a change of life, maybe to some other kind of creature, which we would call reincarnation, but not a resurrection of one's self from the dead. So the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend time in nothing else but telling and hearing something new. What does this tell us about the character of the people of Athens? They were unstable and they were unsure. They had provided gods or idols for all gods and even to the unknown God so that they might not offend any God. And they were also very fickle. They were not committed to any God, and this was something new that they had to learn in the gospel of Christ, commitment and loyalty. They might worship one God for a while and then go worship another one, and then change another one, maybe go back to the first one that they had. That's just the way that religion was in those particular days. So Paul stood in the front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. The King James says superstitious. We kind of take that as a sting. This is a sting either way that you look at it. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Now, whether or not this picture is what Paul saw or not, I cannot say. But this is an altar that was found in Athens. It is dated to about 100 years before Christ, and it says it is dedicated to an unknown God. The top line says, to the God we do not know. I don't know what the rest of it says, but that's as far as my Latin would actually get me. It is probably a combination of Latin and Greek. It looks more Latin than anything else. But this sits there. Now, how could anyone be too or overly religious? This would be when one serves everything and no one in particular. Actually, this is an attack on surface religion. This is that water ski religion that I was telling you about, versus heartfelt and committed religion that's demanded by God. It takes on the hypothetical versus the real. The Athenians would have taken this as a compliment and not as a rebuke. The reason I say this is hypothetical is because these people had never known these particular gods that they worshiped. They came from their own minds, they came from their own culture, and therefore the gods behaved very much like human beings, not like real gods, not like the God who is perfect and holy and righteous. Now, why would they have an altar to the unknown God? Two things in particular, fear and ignorance. They were afraid of offending somebody that they did not know. It was a general honor for a God that they may not have known about yet. And this was a very paganistic society. They worshiped lots of different gods, and they did not want to offend anybody's God. Pausanias and Philostratus both state that there were those kinds of altars in Athens itself. So begins Paul's actual sermon. And I think we're going to stop here. It won't take long for us to finish up the chapter next week, and then we'll get into chapter 18.